With the college football playoffs coming up, I think it's time we go back and re-look through the short but fun history of the 4-team college football playoff and rank every single playoff game and then the championship games until we get to the number one spot and crown the best game ever played. But we're going to start with the oldest playoff and work our way up and then work to the championship. So first, I'm going to have to take you to 2015 Oregon versus Florida State, and man, this game started way better than it ended. Winston was taking on Mariota, both teams were playing with passion. We had lead changes, but at the end of the half, FSU even had a chance to bring it within 2 points before Aguayo missed a 54-yarder. But then, literally, Florida State would just fumble and throw away the game in the second half as they fumbled the first drive, exchanged scores, and then fumbled 3 more times as well as throwing a pick to ensure they would have no chance to win this game, putting it promptly into C tier. We get to immediately shift gears with the second game of the playoffs, and that was Alabama taking on OSU, and I think this is like the honorary championship game because holy shit, it was so good. Alabama comes out and takes a 2-score lead early in the game where OSU gets to claw their way back into it to get down by 1 point at the end of the half and take the lead immediately in the second half. But a pick 6 against Bama to give them a 2-score lead where Alabama scores, then forces a punt in under 40 seconds, and Alabama was actively throwing into the end zone when they got picked off. And I mean, you cannot want much more than this, going directly into an S tier playoff game. On to 2016 where there was a much weaker playoffs. Clemson was taking on Oklahoma in our first contest, and while this game gave us a close first half with Baker Mayfield-led OU team coming out strong, taking the lead and holding it into halftime with the field goal kickers firing on all cylinders, they would completely fall apart in the second half as they would get shut out. They at least looked somewhat competent in the second half despite there still being a flurry of mistakes leading to their downfall, but at the start of the fourth, Clemson scored to go up 37-17, where the ensuing drive would get picked off, meaning we only had to deal with a true 7 minutes of what felt like football limbo where we just waited for the game to end, and thus I'm going to put this one into B tier. Then we had Alabama versus Michigan State that same year. Despite this game having a close first quarter with the score being 0-0, the Spartans would punt 8 of their 12 drives away, throw 2 picks, turn it over on down once, and generally not look competitive at all after a goal line interception at the end of the second quarter took all the wind out of their sails. Meanwhile, Alabama just looked like the better team toying with their food instead of outright dominating them, so half of this game was spent thinking maybe Michigan State could stumble their way to pulling this off before realizing, never mind, it's actually not even going to be close. So I'm going to put this one directly into D tier as well with a final score of 38-0. On to 2017 where we get treated to what I'm going to call a playoff classic where a Crimson Tide team scores 24-ish points and holds the other team to 7 or less points. This time it was the University of Washington, and while these games can feel like a good team toying with their prey, the first half was competitive for the most part until J.K. Scott pinned the Huskies back at the 4, then Jake Browning threw a short pick 6 and an opportunity to take a potential lead, and then the second half it would literally just be a punt off, even with Jake Browning getting in on it, pinning the Tide at the 2, which ironically would turn into their only scoring drive of the second half. But all in all, if you're not totally in on special teams and defense, this game was kind of a snooze fest, but at least it was a relatively close snooze fest, so I'll give it a solid B tier. Now, on the other side, Clemson dog walked Ohio State, and I think the most disappointing thing about this game, aside from the final score obviously, is how close this game was supposed to be compared to the game we actually got. I mean, sure, Ohio State's kickers opened up going 0 for 2, taking all the wind out of their sails early, leading to Clemson having a 17-0 lead going into the half. In the second half, a fumble and 2 interceptions was just enough to ensure that they never got any momentum going as the game ended 31-0. Now, while Clemson's defense was stout, you couldn't help but feel like we got robbed of a better game. On to 2018, where it would give us a reprieve from these non-games as we had a great one with Georgia taking on Oklahoma, and it was an absolute barn burner. Usually SEC versus Big 12 games during these years looked more like SEC games than Big 12 ones, but this was a high-octane shootout for 4 quarters, ending the regulation with a final score of 45-45, where we'd get a great overtime matchup capped by a missed field goal from the Sooners and a touchdown by the Dogs to win it. And if this isn't a football game you want to watch, I don't know what is. S tier automatically. Unfortunately, the other game was not nearly as exciting as Alabama was forced to take on Clemson in the semifinals, and while Alabama put up an impressive 24-6 win, this game was just less exciting than the previous Bama special, and it was just clear for 60 minutes that Bama was going to win the game, which they did, holding the Tigers to 0 touchdowns and putting it once again in B tier. Now, 2019 playoffs opened with one of the worst playoff games, as it was Clemson taking on Notre Dame, where we did get one quarter where it felt like it was close as it ended 3-3. But when Notre Dame turned it over on downs to start the second quarter, Clemson kicked it into high gear for a single quarter to jump ahead by 20 points, and that was the only good quarter of football. They then just coasted out on that lead, getting one more touchdown and fumbling away another chance, while this game ended 30-3, as I will promptly place this one into the D tier and not have to think about it again. Now, this is the same year we got a pretty solid game with Alabama taking on the Sooners, and yes, this game ended up being a 2-score affair, but Oklahoma for the most part executed pretty well in their game plan. They had a fumble and 2 punts which pretty much decided the game, but they would go on to get points on every other drive, but just couldn't quite overcome that first half deficit, which was them going down 28-0, by the way. I think those who watched the game walked away entertained, and for that, I'm going to put it into the A tier. Moving on to 2020, we have one of my favorite games, which is LSU beating the brakes off of Oklahoma. If you're like me, you probably watched the first half just jaw agape as Burrow sliced and diced his defense and knew, like, yeah, that's one of the best college quarterbacks of all time. But if you weren't a Burrow fan and just wanted to watch a good game, you most certainly didn't. Oklahoma gave it their best effort, but a 49-point first half compared to the 14 they put up was just too much to come back in the second half, as they coasted to end this game 63-28, where if you want to watch a dominating offense, it's okay, but it gets a bit stale as they both kick it down again in the second half to just coast this one out. So in my opinion, I would give it a high B tier. The rest of you guys are probably putting it into low C. Now, the other game was significantly better. Ohio State was taking on Clemson for the first time in their postseason, and they gave us a great one. Ohio State jumps out to a 16-0 lead halfway into the second quarter before Clemson locks in and scores, forces the punt and scores again to bring them within 2 by the end of the half. Then, after TikTok star Drew Christmas, a 99-yard drive to score and take the lead before the defenses would battle it out for the rest of the quarter, leading to OSU retaking the lead early in the fourth as they drove 94 yards to score, ultimately winning the game. All in all, though, I just have to give this one an A, maybe because of how the championship went, made this game feel kind of insignificant in my opinion, but like I said, that might just be my Joe Burrow bias. Let me know if you agree though. But the next year was largely a forgettable playoff race and championship, if we are honest. Alabama got to take on Notre Dame, and it was COVID year, and there was just a bunch of weird stuff happening, but Bama rolled past them in a 31-14 showing, and all in all, it's just a C-tier game, where it will be joined by the Buckeyes thoroughly getting their revenge against Clemson, so much so that Clemson is still recovering from that loss, as they got thumped 49-28, in large part thanks to a 28 unanswered point stretch in the first half, where at least Clemson showed more life. So I'm going to put this as a low B-tier game. 2022 was a cool storyline if you're an SEC homer, where I'm pretty sure this playoff game is why the SEC schools think they need upwards of 6 teams in the playoffs, because we got our third Alabama mid-20 entry while holding an opposing team to under 10 points, and that opposing team was Cincinnati, and it was not as close as the score was. Cincinnati's pretty much spent all game on the opposite side of their 50-yard line, and a few times they ended up on the other side of the 50, or dare I say in the red zone, they immediately got stonewalled and were forced to settle for field goals. Overall, I'll stick to giving these games B's because at least they feel somewhat close for a portion of the game, but in hindsight and with clear vision, it was never really that close. And then, of course, Georgia throttled Michigan as it was 27-3 by halftime, as Michigan just could not get out of their own way to look even remotely competitive, and their one lone touchdown came in the most garbage of garbage times, down 33 points with 5 minutes left in the game, where Georgia got the ball back and just held on to it until the game ended 34-11, a blowout where for me, this goes all the way down into the D tier. Now, for some of the greatest playoffs of all time, if you ask me, we've got TCU versus Michigan, a game that should go down to infamy because nobody, and I mean nobody, thought TCU had it in them to take on one of the best Michigan teams in modern history, but my God, they came out hot and punched Michigan square in the mouth, going into halftime 21-6, where they then had to come out and survive an absolute offensive barrage in the second, taking them all the way down to the wire on an absolute haymaker play after haymaker play, coming down to a punt with 52 seconds left in the game, up by 6, where they held on to win. Easily an S tier game, and if you think that one's good, let me take you to Georgia versus Ohio State. High-powered offense taking on the greatest college football defense we may have ever seen in just a beautiful heavyweight match, with CJ Stroud making a case for being one of the highest quarterbacks rated in that class, while Georgia would do their best to keep up with the first half ending 28-20 30-24 in OSU's favor, but that defense would come in clutch in the second half when down by 11 points, forcing the Buckeyes to settle for nothing but punts and field goals for 4 straight drives, allowing Georgia to catch up, take a 1-point lead, but Stroud would brilliantly drive 43 yards in 43 seconds to set up the game-winning 50-yard field goal, and it was wide left as the clock hit 0 on New Year's. Pure cinema, both of these games, and the best playoff weekend easily of all time. 2 S-ranked games to give us out of this. If only the national championship lived up to even a tenth of what these games gave us, it'd be more memorable. Now, last year's playoffs was, in my opinion, a bit of a whimper, okay? The cloud hanging over the Michigan-Alabama game was the obvious fact. I think a lot of people thought FSU should be in there, and whether you agree or not, it does feel weird to have a completely undefeated ACC championship left out of the playoffs. And the game itself was just a down step from last year. Michigan taking on Alabama was a relatively exciting, low-scoring affair, but it was mostly just Alabama making mistake after mistake, and Michigan just sort of coming away with the win. Like, even on Alabama's final play of the game, you kind of just went, oh, I guess that's how the game's going to end. But despite it all, I'm going to give this one a low A, which is kind of sad for an overtime playoff game. But the final playoff game before we jump into the championships goes to Texas versus Washington. And I'm not even going to lie, I didn't even watch this game live. I can't tell you how unexciting this matchup seemed for me, but I did go back and rewatch it recently. And yeah, I'm not sure if it's because I'm a Coug, but watching UW win was like the equivalent of being forced to perform a root canal on myself with nothing but a rusty screwdriver. And also the fact that you could not help but feel like the other game being played was the actual Natty, which is something that kind of trended throughout this, meant that when it was all over, I just couldn't help but feel unexcited by this game. I gave this game a B, but let me know if you guys felt something different about this game. But now on to the national championships and how they compare. All the way back to Ohio State versus Oregon, this is another one of those games where you felt like the actual championship took place in the semifinals when Alabama got knocked off by Ohio State, and then it translated to this game not being particularly close. I mean, Oregon tried to keep up, but that Ezekiel Elliott ground attack was one of the most deadly we've ever seen out of college, and like I said, Oregon probably got lulled to sleep by pimp smacking FSU so bad before this, and the Ohio State team came in and just rocked their world. Overall, if you're an OSU fan, this is probably an S. If you're a Duck, it's a D. For everybody else, it's probably like a C. Now, the 2016 championship game gave us the start to one of the best postseason rivalries of the last decade in Clemson versus Alabama, where they would see each other in the postseasons 4 years in a row. But this first game that started it all was a great one. It's neck and neck the whole way, tied at halftime, Clemson with a 3-point lead going into the fourth before Bama just pressed the gas pedal with a field goal, surprise onside, and touchdown to completely change the course of this game, where Clemson went through having what felt like a good head start to now playing catch up until the very end, where they scored to get within 5 but couldn't convert the onside to end the game. Overall, like an A+ tier game to start the rivalry, only because the final few minutes still felt pretty far out of reach if Clemson wanted to win, as they would need an absolute miracle. Still an amazing game though. The next year they would meet again in the championship, and this is probably the game all championships want to be like. Alabama takes the first half with a 7-point lead and turns that into a 10-point lead deep into the third and holds it. Clemson would attempt to storm back with 2 touchdowns before giving the Alabama the ball with 5 minutes left in a 4-point lead, where they would find the end zone with a little over 2 minutes off a big Jalen Hurts run, where we would get the drive of ages. Clemson drives all the way down to the 9-yard line, but on 2nd and goal, Alabama gets a penalty to bring it to the 1, where Clemson, with seconds left in the game, could elect to kick the field goal and go into overtime, but in one of the most daring moves, decide to run a play instead to take the lead, where Deshaun Watson finds Hunter Renfrow in the end zone. And while many believe that there should have been a pass interference call on this, it just adds to the stakes of this game, fueling this rivalry even more. And in an even more daring move, they call the surprise onside this year to make sure Alabama never gets to touch it offensively again. This game was amazing. One of my favorites and just a great game. Overall, S+. The following year, after knocking off Clemson in the semifinal, they had to take on Georgia once again, and just cinema. Alabama looks dead in the water the entire first half. Georgia jumps ahead 13 points, leading to the unprecedented move of benching Jalen Hurts in favor of Tua Tagovailoa, who not only led them to a gritty, gutsy comeback, but almost won them the game if it wasn't for Bama's true kryptonite, their field goal kicker, who missed from 36 6 yards out. Then Georgia hits their overtime field goal. Tua immediately takes a stack, moving it back to the 41. Things look grim, but Tua steps back and finds future Heisman winner Devontae Smith on one of the single best plays in the history of the playoffs to win the game in overtime and crown Tua the man for Bama, making this another S-tier game to watch. But that was like the last good championship. The next year, Alabama comes back to Clemson, and in a game that was supposed to be another close heavyweight battle, Clemson completely dismantled them under young star Trevor Lawrence. As for one of the only times in the Nick Saban era, Alabama looked completely outmatched as Tua threw away the game with 2 picks and turning it over on downs for the first 3 drive in the second half as they ended the game 44-16 in a solid C-tier championship game held up only by a close-ish first half. The next year wouldn't be much better. An easily top 5 team of all time, LSU Tigers, took on just a pretty good Clemson team and handily dismantled them under the weight of 6 touchdowns and a 521-yard performance by Joe Burrow, cementing him as having one of, if not the single best college quarterback seasons of all time. And I mean, it's cool if you want to see one of the best seasons, but aside from that, it wasn't pretty close. But since it's my video, this is a B tier. Once again, the following year, Alabama comes back and takes on Ohio State in the championship. And well, the lackluster playoffs, like I said, resulted in an even more lackluster championship as Bama rolled past Ohio State, who was playing only their 8th game of the season compared to Alabama's 13th. I don't know, man. This was a dumb season. This is a D tier championship. The 2021 championship, though, was also not much better as it stung for many fans that it was a repeat of the SEC championship game. But this time it starts off with a heavy field goal half, followed by a quiet lone touchdown third quarter to then have Georgia run away with it in the fourth to make this game seem a lot less boring than it was. Yeah, most of this game was just a little stale as 2 teams with good defenses made sure the other couldn't do much, so I'll give this one a low C. But if you thought this was bad, boy, oh boy, you should already know where this is going. Let me take you to Georgia versus TCU. I've already made an extensive video about this game, but the gist of it is that TCU, the whole season, had seemed like this gritty, punching above their weight class team, and were taking on a giant in Georgia in what seemed to be the David versus Goliath scenario, just for us to realize that David forgot his sling, so Goliath grabbed him by the ankle and did like Hulk did to Loki, and the results reflected that. The most miserable 4 quarters of football you'll ever have to watch, as I think there was hardly 5 minutes of this game that actually felt close, with a final score of 65-7. I don't think anybody thinks fondly of this game except for SEC apologists, so I'm going to make a special F tier just for this game. And then finally, last game of the year, Michigan taking on Washington. Was there anyone excited about this game? Like I said, it felt like the championship was played around earlier, with Michigan sneaking out a win over Alabama, and then that was made more obvious when Michigan just slaughtered their opponent, and I almost forgot, but there was also the whole Michigan cheating scandal hanging over everybody's head, which just put a big damper on the final game. It goes into C tier, nothing special about it, but that means across all these games, what has been the single greatest game in the college football championship series? And I've got to give it to Alabama versus Clemson when Clemson kicks the onside kick. That moment will always be special to me. What a gutsy play. That game was just amazing in general. If you haven't taken a second to go back and watch it, it's also just part of an awesome rivalry. You can't feel bad about it, but I wouldn't fault you for picking the Alabama Tua Tagovailoa comeback story the following year. As always, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think it is. Hopefully we get more good games this year, and peace.